tonight? All right, thank you guys for making it up. I know it is cold and a little bit rainy. You guys are in for a treat, though. We are here to see the amazing Robert Buxton. Have you guys seen him before? Yes, he is an amazing pianist, storyteller, and all-around good guy. So let's give him a Searstone welcome. Robert.
Good evening. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you very much for the kind words and for the introduction. Jackie was just, I'm kind of embarrassed. Well, she was telling me that she does triathlons, and that's really something. Unbelievable. I respect it so much. So we actually get to sit when we do what we do. Think about it. It's all perspective. But yeah, so what I like to do first, before playing, real music, is something I always do, which is improvise. Because improvisation, the more I read about it, I realize it's such an important part of what we call classical music. They used to improvise all the time. Somewhere in the 20th century, we stopped, us classical people. We decided, no, the music has to be put in a museum, and it shouldn't be. So I forced myself to improvise, as uncomfortable as it is. Maybe it's not as uncomfortable as the end of the triathlon, but so here's what we'll do today. There are many ways to do this. What I was thinking is we just do random notes that you give me and create a melody, and I'll make something out of that. Is that okay? Okay, so can I have a note, please? C. That's always good. Okay, I need a few more. You can sharp and flat them if you want.
A sharp.
A sharp. Is that what you said? Yeah. Okay, yeah, a couple more.
F.
Oh, maybe one more.
G.
Sounds like a fanfare or something. Okay, so we'll see what happens. You gave me C, A sharp, F, G. Thank you. Thanks for that melody. It was nice. Maybe I'll steal it from you. Write something with it. I like to start with a piece that's quite depressing. Forgive me. I like to start with the depressing things, because unfortunately, life can't always be happy. And same with music. This is from an opera, Orpheus, by Gluck, G-L-U-C-K. Gluck was a Viennese opera composer in the mid-18th century. So he lived a bit before Mozart, and Mozart was influenced by him, especially in his opera compositions. So, Gluck, if you get a chance to see a Gluck opera, you should. Even on YouTube, it's incredible what he does. Now, this Orpheus story is the foundation for all opera. The first opera in the 16th century was based on that story, because musicians like the Orpheus myth. What does he play? He plays a harp. Isn't the piano sort of a sideways harp with some hammers, pretty much. So the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, Eurydice's wife dies, and she goes to the underworld. And Orpheus can't accept it, and he goes after her, follows her, and he brings his lyre, his harp, L-Y-R-E, not L-I-A-R, like we did for me, right? So he goes and pleads with Hades to release her, and he plays music for Hades. You can already see that this works for an opera. And finally, Hades says, okay, you can bring her with you to Earth, but don't look back. You might have heard that phrase before in the Bible. There's that same line, don't look back, in the Old Testament. So, unfortunately, how can you not look back at your loved one who died and you're bringing them back? He did look back, Orpheus did, at the last moment, and loses her forever. So it's a very tragic story. But when I saw the opera at the Met, I was amazed because they actually, at the very end, Eurydice just comes back and they have this big party and everyone lives happily ever after. It's nice. That's the 18th century, it's the Age of Enlightenment. Voltaire and Rousseau, you can't end things like the Greeks did. So this piece is a melody, it's instrumental in the opera, and it's from a section called the Dance of the Blessed Spirit, so there's some ballet that goes on with it. The original piece, I love playing arrangements because I just love to pretend to be not a pianist, something else. The original is scored for flute and strings, and there are many arrangements of this. Violinists play, cellists play. This version for piano is by a wonderful Italian composer from the 19th century, Scambati, the name is, which is also a beautiful sounding name, I think, Scambati. So this is the Gluck Scambati melody from Orpheus. It's in the key of D minor, which is famously a mournful key. This is Orpheus lamenting, his wife. It's just it's just music of grief. And just for some interesting comparison, Mozart's famous Requiem, D minor. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, D minor. You can just name, it's almost as if the key of D minor has some kind of tragic or mournful connotation to it, character to it. So here is the piece, Melody by Gluck Scambati from Orpheus. Thank you. And I tell people about this piece because many people will come to me and they'll say, classical music, it's hard for me to really relate to. Yes, it's old. It's very old. It's like, 300 years old, the music. And then the story of Orpheus and Eurydice is even older than that. But I think fundamentally humans haven't changed all that much. I mean, they wear different styles of clothes, but I don't think the human nature is all that different. And I think also that with classical music, a piece like that, the first thing to start with is your own reaction to the music and to trust it. There's not somebody sitting somewhere who has all the perfect knowledge. If there were, I'd like to meet them, but to explain to you exactly what it all means. Because I think that with this piece, if you've ever experienced the loss of a loved one, you get it. And that's it. And if you want to study the history and the theory behind the piece, well, that's great and that's important, but it's secondary. The primary is that emotional thing. So the next piece is something that everyone knows, and I don't know if I know it that well because it's a little bit newish for me, but I want to play it. This is Liszt's arrangement of Schubert, Ave Maria, which is, of course, such a famous vocal piece, the Ave Maria by Schubert. Now, you probably, when you hear it, mostly it's sung in Latin, with the Hail Mary verses in Latin. But that's not how Schubert wrote it. He wrote it with German lyrics, and it was a German translation of the poem The Lady of the Lake. It's an Arthurian legend by Sir Walter Scott. And there's some German translation. And the original text is a prayer to Mary, but German text. I don't know. I've heard it sung in Latin, and that came later. It works, but that's not how Schubert wrote it. Of course, Liszt arranged a number of Schubert's Lieder, including Lieder songs for voice and piano, including this one. And what he does, and it's fascinating, the arrangement is like, I probably said this last time, arrangement is like translation in literature. And it's not just the original text that matters, it's also the translator and what they do with their translation, because it's not Google Translate we're talking about. There's a reimagining that happens, a recomposing, co-composing or something. So Liszt gives the melody, the first verse that is pretty straightforward in the beginning. So I mean, that's, I guess, a tenor or someone who's singing down it. But that's pretty much what Schubert wrote, but it's adapted for solo piano. I'm not going to sing it in German, just in case. To tell you, I can't. Then what Liszt does with each verse, a singer, the words will change, and the music itself not necessarily. They might sing it a little differently each verse. The notes don't change, but what Liszt does, because it's a solo piano piece, he completely changes the next verses, and he puts more lists into it. So the next verse. So all that writing stuff, that ain't Schubert, So here it is. Good luck to me also because I just learned it. This arrangement is kind of tricky because it's Liszt, but I wanted to share it with you. This is Schubert's Ave Maria arranged by Liszt. And real quick, I forgot to mention, Schubert died at the age of 31, which is unthinkable. He was very ill in his later years, and he knew that his time was limited. And sometimes he would compose several Lieder like this in a single day because he wanted to put everything out before he knew his time would end. So unbelievable to just consider that. 1797 to 1828. And he was unknown in his lifetime. Penniless. He didn't have enough to eat even. And it was after he died, actually, Franz Liszt sort of, I don't want to say discovered him, but he came across his music and just couldn't believe what a miracle it was. And he did these arrangements of Schubert Lieder and played them at his early concerts in the 1830s. So Liszt is very much a reason or the reason why Schubert is remembered as he should be today. And now I'd like to play some of the music of Robert Schumann, not Schubert, similar name, but they're different. So this is from a set of pieces from which I played some others for you in the past. The last time I was here, the last couple times I was here, I played you some of Schumann's Paganini studies. These are his arrangements, or really his adaptations of solo violin caprices by Niccolo Paganini, the great violinist, the great wild man of the late 18th, early 19th centuries. Paganini was the Jimi Hendrix of that time, and I'm not joking really, it's not an exaggeration, because the way he played the violin, the way he lived his life, and people's perception of him, like some people thought he was possessed. You know, it parallels some of the rock stars of the 20th century, like Jimi Hendrix or Jim Morrison or something. He was just this wild man. And the Romantic generation, who came a bit later, like Schumann and Liszt and others, they heard Paganini and they just couldn't believe it. It was a revelation for them. And they wanted to channel Paganini into their piano music. So Schumann was actually the first, as I understand, to arrange Paganini's caprices, solo violin caprices for piano. Liszt did his more famous arrangements later. So Schumann, he heard Paganini early 1830s and he just set to work doing these arrangements. So Schumann did 12. For some reason, he arranged 12 out of 24 of the Paganini caprices. And the first 6, and that's from which I was playing when I was here like half a year ago, or a little more, over the summer. I didn't even know this until after I played them for people. Schumann did not want them to be played in public. He said, these are not meant to be played in public because they're pedagogical pieces. Oops. But I don't really agree with that. I think they're wonderful arrangements. An arrangement doesn't have to divert much from the original, like Liszt did in that. And it's wonderful. I mean, they're both good. It's good to have an arrangement that's very close to the original. Because what Schumann did was he took the one-line violin music and he would just add some accompaniment to it, but not much more than that. It changes the whole nature of it. But that's the first 6, and that's what I played from earlier when we met in the summer. What I'm playing now is from that second set of studies, and Schumann takes a lot more liberty with it. He said that's what he meant. He meant to do consciously. He changes the music, and to the point that I don't even feel it's Paganini anymore. I feel it's Schumann. I mean, Paganini, the skeleton of Paganini's music is there, but this is Robert Schumann. And I think Schumann used these studies like the way a fine art student would go to a museum and copy masters. I think that's what Schumann is doing. And it's fascinating how in these ones I'm going to play for you now, it's so Schumann-esque. He found his himself through imitation. And Robert Schumann had a fascinating life and a very different life from a lot of the great composers. He was not a natural at it, and this is what really intrigues me about him. He originally wanted to be a novelist. His favorite writer was, for example, E.T.A. Hoffmann, who wrote The Nutcracker. And Schumann read his novellas, voraciously read them. And E.T.A. Hoffmann's writing is all fragmentary. He'll have one idea, one plot, and then a splice, and then something else, and then something If you ever want to read him, read The Life and Opinions of the Tomcat Murr, based on the Lawrence Stern title, Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy. That's an incredible book, and it's hilarious because it's from the perspective of a cat, composer's cat, and he's talking about how dogs are uncultured, and he falls in love with this other cat, but she doesn't love him back, and he writes all this poetry. It's just it's bizarre, and it's wonderful. And that's what Schumann originally wanted to do, and then that didn't work out. So then he wanted to be a virtuoso pianist, because the pianos were changing the way they were built in those days. They were making them sturdier. You've heard Beethoven would break Viennese pianos by the way he played. Well, Beethoven eventually got an English, I think he first had a French and then an English-built Broadwood piano, which had this thing called a cast iron frame, so that strings won't snap. And that creates it so you can have virtuosity on the piano, more of it. There's a story, there's a pianist from that time, Dreischock, his name was, and the critics said that he played so loud that if the wind was right, you could hear him in Vienna from Paris. That was the time. But see, Schumann failed at that too. He damaged his hands trying to become a virtuoso pianist. He may have used a wooden device to strengthen his pinky finger, which you shouldn't do it. You know, that's just anatomy. The pinky's not as strong as the other. Well, he damaged his hands, so he couldn't do that. Then he finally turned to composition and put all his energy and his creativity into that. So maybe the most important, or one of the most important things about his life and about his compositional style, Robert Schumann had bipolar disorder. And they didn't have the treatments they have now, or the understanding that they have of it now, and his life was so difficult. And I also do think there is a sense of that in his music, the wild mood swings. Like this first one I'm going to play in C minor, it's, once my grandmother said I played with Schumann. She was a big music lover. And she said, well, he's all over the place. Yes, that's the point. Here's the one I'm going to play now. It begins with this elegy. And then, I don't know, out of the blue, there's a march. Why? It doesn't make sense. But that's Schumann. There's not so much continuity. It's just you have one thing, and another thing, and another thing, and you're going to think it's over about 3 or 4 times, and it's not. And he goes to another idea. There was one pianist who criticized the Davidsbündler Tanz, which I love. I played the piece before. I love it. It's by Schumann. And it's a collection of very short pieces that he plays sort of uninterrupted one after another. And this pianist, I won't say the name, he said, I don't like it. It's shish kebab. It's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and it's all just thrown together. And when I read that, I was upset because, first of all, what's wrong with shish kebab? How is that an insult? And then number 2, what's wrong with Schumann, the way he is? Why not? So listening to Schumann, it's not like the other pieces, like the other 2 I played. It's different. He jumps around a little bit. It's a little bit fragmentary, but that's the point. So that's what he was, and what his music is. Here is the first Paganini study of Robert Schumann. Schumann and listening to his music, I was thinking at the end, there was this accompaniment that just... Schumann loves that. I call it the swirling waves, like when you go out to swim in the ocean, which I did on New Year's Day in Atlantic Beach. It was kind of dumb, maybe, but I'm half Russian. You know, the Russians do that. It's the polar plunge or whatever. But you know, you can feel the waves whoosh, the whoosh feeling. And I had a teacher who said, whenever Schumann does that, and it's a lot like the piano concerto does it all the time. He said it's like Van Gogh's Starry Night, that swirling sky. And there's another artist who struggled with mental illness. And I love that connection. You know, I love connecting music with paintings and poetry, whatever. You know, it's not a literal thing, but it says something. And finally, here's a story about Schumann and playing his music. In the 1950s, the pianist Walter Gieseking, if that name rings a bell, he was giving a master class. And Gieseking was a French-born German pianist. Not a great person, just put that out there. He was kind of a collaborator with the Nazis. He also wrote a book, which I read, that's called, I forget what it's called, but it's his theory of how to practice the piano. And he pretty much says, don't practice the piano with the piano. That's for amateurs. Take the sheet music and study it and commit it completely to your memory. And only when it's completely inside your mind, then play it. Okay, a little bit of that goes a long way. I tried to do that one summer and I just ended up with a massive migraine. But I still do it in small doses. But this is Gieseking. He was a kind of jerk, okay? So, sorry to say that. I mean, he was a great musician, but the whole thing with the fascists. So he was giving a master class in the 50s, and there was this young boy playing Schumann. And he stopped him. He said, start again, and don't stop whatever I say or do. Okay, fair enough. So the boy's playing, and Walter Gieseking is like standing right here, screaming insults at this poor kid. And this kid is playing, and he's just like crying. And he finishes, and this boy is sobbing, he's just out, completely, his ego has been broken down. And Walter Gieseking sits down, and he smiles, and he says, good, now you're ready to understand Schumann, how to play. I mean, that's a terrible way to get the point across, but it's fascinating, and there's a little truth in that story. So the next piece I'm going to play is a little closer to Paganini's original, but it's still a Schumann thing. This is the original piece for violin. It sounds a lot like another Paganini piece, the La Campanella. And both of those pieces have this alternation, like a seesaw. You can hear that, And what is that on the violin? It's a study for the bow. Da, 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 da. Right. But what Schumann does to me is he turns this study into what sounds like a monologue, an incessant monologue, like somebody talking without even breathing, just frantic talking. My great-grandmother had bipolar disorder, like Schumann, and my dad, who's very close to her, told me that she would, when she was in a manic phase, would talk a lot, incessantly. And it was as if she didn't even take breaths in between her thoughts. And that's what this piece is like. There's barely a semicolon or a comma or any punctuation in it. It's just this straightforward 16th notes. And it just goes and goes and goes. And so somehow Schumann, that's how he makes it, in my opinion, his own. Here's another one of Paganini, Schumann studies. things. So perhaps the main course tonight will be Brahms, Paganini Variations, Book 2. And, well, Brahms is a very logical next composer to play after Schumann. Because, you know, the young Brahms, this young man from Hamburg, born in 1833, in the 1850s he went to Dusseldorf, where Robert Schumann and Clara Schumann, his wife, a great musician herself, where they lived. He knocked on their door and had his 3 piano sonatas with him in his suitcase, maybe a toothbrush also, I don't know. And he said, "Hi, I'm Johannes Brahms. Can I get some advice from you, some help?" And the Schumanns, they invited him in. He played for them, and they said, "Why don't you just live with us? We'll adopt you." That's sort of what they did. Things were different in the 50s, the 1850s. They didn't do background checks or whatever like they do now. Can you imagine now some kid coming to your door? I would like some advice. Well, just live with me, fine. And then that's what it was. And unfortunately, Robert Schumann, do I have time to play this? Forgive me, I think I jumped the gun. I wanted to, before this piece, I wanted to play, and it kind of fits into all this. Let me play you another piece by Schumann, a late piece of Schumann's, very short. You just heard some of his early music that he wrote in a manic phase. As he said it, in a white heat. Schumann wrote not only those Paganini studies, he wrote the Carnival and a bunch of his other cycles. So I'm mixing and matching many things, but Brahms is already there. And Robert Schumann, by this time, I mentioned he had bipolar, but he was not a crazy person, some people say. He was a wonderful person. He was a great husband and a great father. He had 7 children with Clara. And actually, as a father, he relived his own childhood. And he wrote all these childhood-themed pieces like the Kindersingen and other things, including this piece I'm going to play. It's from a set called Music for Children, Young and Old, Abendlied, Evening Song. And I want to play it because it was around this time Schumann started to hear voices. And he also started to hear the note A ringing incessantly. And a lot of his late music is in the key of A. It's interesting. Some historians think he had lead poisoning too. I don't know. So, and he heard voices. He jumped into the icy Rhine River in the middle of winter. Some fishermen rescued him, and he was sent to an asylum, which in those days was more like a prison. No visitors allowed. He couldn't speak. He was incapacitated, catatonic. His wife snuck in at the end to see him, and Robert Schumann died at the age of 47. And so I thought I'd play this late piece of Schumann's. Now the interesting thing is it's a little creepy, but I'll just tell you that a lot of Schumann's late music is the early stuff is what's wild and over the top. This is it's so calm. It even sounds rational. And that's the bizarre thing. There's a piece he wrote called Ghost Variations, which I don't think I want to play. It just scares me because in the middle of writing that is when he jumped in the Rhine River. And that piece is so calm. It's just, sometimes calm is not helpful. So anyway, but it's, again, with his condition, we can't understand it unless we've lived it, I don't know, so, or if you know someone who's going through that. So here's the Abendlied, Evening Song by Robert Schumann. now back to Brahms, because this is all happening around the same time, towards the end of Schumann's life. So after Schumann died, the young Brahms and Clara, who was about, I don't know, almost 20 years, 15 to 20 years older than him, so maybe less, but she was a lot older than him. They went with 7 children, but by the way, the 7th child, I think, was born when Schumann was in the asylum. So they traveled to Switzerland on this trip, obviously to process the grief of what had just happened. And it wasn't just Clara's husband and Brahms' mentor, it was the musical. I mean, it was the friendship between them. They had this deep bond, But the neighbors started thinking this was strange, especially this is like the 19th century. What is this young 20-something-year-old man doing with this Clara Schumann? And so the rumor started that they were romantically involved. And this has persisted until today. There was a movie in the 1940s about this. Katharine Hepburn played the role of Clara Schumann. Great actress. And it makes for some good Hollywood, but not good history, because from the historians I've read, probably not. How could it be? It's been overblown. It's kind of like the Mozart and Salieri story. It's a great story, but it ain't true, because Salieri and Mozart, they hardly knew each other. If anything, they respected each other. Salieri didn't harm Mozart or anything. And finally, Salieri is a great composer. I want to play his music soon, actually. It's on my to-do list. But anyway, back to this, Brahms. This story of the romance between Brahms and Clara is very interesting. It's kind of the People magazine-like, material. But they definitely had feelings for each other, unrequited feelings. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't alive at that time, so nobody really knows. But just my understanding is it's been overblown. But definitely Brahms had they both, but especially Brahms, had feelings for Clara. And he never married, and he was kind of a loner the rest of his life. And he would write these letters. They both wrote to each other, beautiful letters, but especially Brahms would write to Clara asking for her musical advice. And you can kind of read between the lines his feelings. But he's from Hamburg, I told you. Hamburg people are not known for being very expressive. I think someone here told me they knew someone from Hamburg, and anyway. So it's not that the feelings are not there, they're here. They're here, but they're not wearing their heart on their sleeve like, say, Paganini would, who's from Genoa, by the way. It's a much sunnier city than Hamburg. So, and I think that's fundamental to Brahms' music, too, that there's something concealed. This is the difficulty of his music, I think. Is on the surface, it sounds sort of formal and reserved, but underneath it is this volcano of feeling. I think that's kind of the point with Brahms. So anyway, Brahms sent these variations to Clara when he wrote them in 1862. So I think he'd already left by this time, lived in Vienna by this point. And Clara hated this piece. She called it Wretched Witches Variations. And usually Brahms would listen to everything Clara said. For some reason he didn't listen to her, so I don't know. Now the Paganini variations are based on the famous 24th Caprice. By the way, I played you book 1, I think in September or August, I forget when, but I played you book 1. I remember this is book 2, so I owe you book 2, right? Now what Brahms initially set out to do was just to write exercises. That's it, finger exercise. I call them sadistic finger torture, because that's what it is. And then he realized that these exercises had character, they had soul and depth, so he changed it into a set of variations. Well, go figure. It's both a set of exercises and a set of variations. That's what I would say. So it's the worst, the best of both worlds. That it's on the one hand very challenging athletically to play. But the music itself is what matters. And these feelings, I think, that he had for Clara, even in this fiery piece, you hear some variations that suggest this unrequited love. Tell me if this doesn't sound, does this sound like a 29-year-old's music? I'm going to play you some parts. Really? Or even more interesting is how does he pull that out of, his variations are all related to that theme. So, interesting to consider. Anyway, Brahms' Paganini Variations, Book 2, this is longer than the others, so this I think will be maybe the last classical piece I play tonight. We'll see. We're going to move for other stuff, but not stuff, music. Here we go. piece called Debussy. Very different from Brahms, very different from Schumann. I think it's the language. Take the phrase, I'm hungry, and say it in German, Ich habe Hunger. It's very articulated, like Brahms, like his music. But in French, what is it? J'ai faim. Oh, you know, it's like the mouth doesn't even move practically. And music speaks French. Claude Debussy, people called him an impressionist. And I think that it fits. He didn't like the term, you know, he hated it. But I like thinking of his music like the Monet and Renoir paintings. So this is a song, also a vocal piece, Bonsoir, beautiful evening. And I don't sing in French, so this is an arrangement by Daniel Ericourt. If anyone spent any time in Greensboro, that name might ring a bell. So Daniel Ericourt was born in Paris in 1903, outside Paris, actually. And he knew Debussy. He actually had a crush on Debussy's daughter, it's a whole story. He knew Maurice Ravel, and eventually in the 30s he came to the US, taught in a few places, ended up teaching at UNCG in Greensboro, lived most of his life there. And he married Jane Ericourt, who's still very much active. I know her, I'm friends with her, and she's been giving me stacks of sheet music from her late husband, original pieces, arrangements, and I thought, so this is from that stack of music. I don't even know if it's published, this arrangement, but it's lovely. And it's been really fascinating to learn about music history from Jane, because the man she was married to, her husband, was literally in that world of France at the turn of the early 20th century. So, yeah, here's the piece. It's much more subtle than the Brahms and the Schumann. It's very soft and very quiet. It's very French. It's like perfume or something. I don't know. So, Bonsoir by Claude Debussy. Not classical, this is gospel. And I like to close with gospel, Southern gospel music. Maybe I told you this last time, but it's the truth, and I love to tell this. I love to tell the story. There's another gospel song, right? This is so my mother's an immigrant from the Soviet Union, and she raised me on classical music. And my uncle, my late uncle Boris, also this music and the whole world. I didn't play any Russian music today, but just in the Soviet Union, this music was so important to them, and still is for my mother. My father's also an immigrant, and he's from very different countries, from Southern Virginia. And he raised me on old-time Southern gospel music. I'm going to play some of that right now. So I had these two worlds, growing up with. They're actually very similar, the two cultures. They both just, very expressive and like to eat. So here is an old gospel song called Just a Little Talk with Jesus.